One unexpected office call changed how I saw my work, my worth, and myself forever. Before we begin, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe for more real-life stories like this. I never thought that an ordinary workday could quietly reroute the way I understood my own life. But that's exactly what happened on a calm Tuesday morning. The kind of morning where the city moves slowly and everyone still carries the weight of the weekend in their posture. I had just settled at my desk with a cup of coffee that had already gone lukewarm when my phone vibrated. It was a call from my boss's assistant, Daniel. He was known for being composed and direct, the type of person who never called unless there was a reason. He asked if I could come up to the main office when I had a moment. His voice wasn't urgent, but there was something in it that made me straighten my back without even realizing why. As a woman in my mid-50s who had spent years in the same company, I knew unexpected invitations upstairs usually meant extra responsibility or quiet trouble. As I walked down the hallway, I tried to convince myself it was nothing serious. The office sounded the same as always, keyboards clicking, printers humming, muffled conversations drifting from cubicles, yet something inside me felt slightly off, like the air had shifted. When I reached the glass door to the executive suite, I noticed it was half open and the lights inside were dimmer than usual. My boss wasn't there. Daniel stood near the window, looking out at the parking lot as if gathering his thoughts. When he turned toward me, he smiled politely, but his expression carried a careful sincerity I hadn't seen before. He thanked me for coming and gestured for me to sit. Instead of taking his usual seat, he leaned against the desk, grounding himself before speaking. That was the moment I realized this wasn't about schedules or paperwork. The room felt still, almost intimate in its quiet, and I became aware of my own breathing. He told me he wanted to speak privately and hoped I didn't mind. His words came slowly, honestly, without the usual office filter. He spoke about how he had noticed the way I carried responsibility, how I accepted every task without complaint, how I kept everything running smoothly without asking for recognition. Then he paused and said that someone needed to acknowledge that weight. I hadn't expected that, not even slightly. A warmth spread through me, the kind that comes from being truly seen after years of blending into the background. In that softly lit office, listening to someone speak with genuine respect. I sensed that this conversation was only the beginning of something I didn't yet understand, but was finally ready to face. When I returned to my cubicle after that conversation, everything looked the same, yet it felt completely different. The office buzzed with its usual rhythm as people moved between desks, carried folders, and talked about ordinary things, but I felt as though I was walking through a softer version of the morning I had started with. Something inside me had shifted, subtle but undeniable. I sat down and opened my computer, trying to focus on my work, but my thoughts kept circling back to Daniel's words. They weren't dramatic or exaggerated. They were simple, sincere, and unexpectedly grounding. I realized how long it had been since anyone had spoken to me that way, without an agenda, without expectation. For years, I had built my identity around being dependable and quiet, the person who handled everything without drawing attention. Somewhere along the way, I had convinced myself that this was enough, that being unnoticed was the price of stability. A couple of hours passed before I sensed someone standing near my cubicle. When I looked up, it was Daniel. He waited patiently until I finished typing before speaking, his presence calm and respectful. He asked if I had a moment, his voice low enough that it felt personal rather than professional. I agreed, standing before I could talk myself out of it. We walked together to the small break room at the end of the hall. It was nearly empty, filled only with the quiet hum of appliances and soft sunlight filtering through the blinds. The atmosphere felt relaxed, unpressured. We sat across from each other at the small table, and for a moment neither of us spoke. Then he said he wanted to make sure he hadn't overwhelmed me earlier. That question alone caught me off guard. It wasn't common for someone to check in on how I felt, especially in a workplace where efficiency mattered more than emotion. I told him the truth, that it hadn't been overwhelming, just unexpected. I admitted I wasn't used to being noticed so directly. He smiled gently and said that noticing was often easy, but speaking up took intention. His words settled into the space between us, warm and reassuring. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It felt honest, like a pause that didn't need to be filled. Then he added something that reached deeper than anything he'd said before. He explained that his words weren't only about my work, but about me as a person, about how I constantly put others first and rarely stopped to consider myself. That struck a place I usually kept guarded. I had spent years managing responsibilities, caring for family, accepting disappointments, and telling myself that my feelings could wait. Hearing someone recognize that without judgment felt like a window opening in a room I didn't realize had grown stuffy. When I admitted I never thought anyone was paying attention, he calmly replied that he was, perhaps more than I realized. That statement lingered, creating a quiet emotional clarity rather than tension. As we left the break room and returned to our desks, the rest of the day unfolded normally, yet I carried a sense of reassurance with me. It was the understanding that even in ordinary places, honest moments can appear and gently change the way you see yourself. The next morning, I arrived at the office earlier than usual. I told myself it was simply to get a head start on the workload, but deep down I knew there was more to it. I carried a quiet curiosity about how the day might unfold after everything that had been said. The building was calm at that hour, wrapped in a peaceful stillness that made every sound feel more noticeable. Sunlight streamed softly through the windows, painting pale gold and blue across the floors. As I set my bag down and headed toward the break room for coffee, I noticed Daniel already there, standing by the counter with a mug in his hand. He looked up, surprised, but his expression warmed immediately. He mentioned that I was early, and I pointed out that he was too. There was no awkwardness, just an easy exchange that felt natural. He said he liked having a few quiet moments before the day began, and I understood exactly what he meant. The office felt different without the usual rush, more reflective, more human. As we stood there, we both reached for the sugar at the same time, then pulled back in unison, almost instinctively. It was a small, ordinary moment, yet it carried a strange sense of connection, the kind that doesn't need explanation. We sat at the small table near the window, and after a brief pause, he asked if we could continue the conversation from the day before, only if I was comfortable. I surprised myself by agreeing without hesitation. He didn't rush his words. Instead, he spoke with the same steady honesty, saying he had been thinking about how long I had been handling everything on my own. He reminded me that I didn't have to keep doing that. I admitted that over the years, I had grown used to not expecting support. Life had taught me to rely on myself because it felt safer that way. Then he asked a simple question that left me still. He asked who took care of me. There was no pressure in his tone, no assumption, just genuine concern. I realized how rarely I allowed myself to consider that question. When I told him I was still figuring it out, he gently suggested that maybe I didn't have to figure it out alone. That thought settled into me slowly, bringing with it a quiet warmth rather than fear. As more employees began arriving and the building gradually filled with noise, the moment between us didn't disappear. It grounded itself in the reality of the day ahead. Before we returned to work, he told me he admired the way I carried myself, my patience, my strength, and the consistency I brought to everything I did. Hearing admiration without expectation felt unfamiliar, almost disarming. As we walked back into the growing hum of the office, I realized something important. What was unfolding wasn't dramatic or impulsive. It was built on understanding, respect, and recognition. And for the first time in a long while, the routine of my day didn't feel heavy. It felt manageable, even meaningful, as though something steady and honest had quietly begun to take shape. The following days at work settled into a calm, unfamiliar rhythm that I found myself quietly appreciating. Nothing outwardly dramatic happened, yet everything felt different beneath the surface. Daniel and I didn't make announcements or change our routines in obvious ways. Instead, there was a steady presence between us that reshaped the way each day unfolded. He would stop by my desk with a simple question, asking how a task was going or whether I needed anything. And those small check-ins carried more meaning than he probably realized. I felt acknowledged in ways I hadn't before, not praised loudly, but genuinely noticed. One afternoon, we were assigned a project that required us to work closely together. We spread documents across a conference table, the late-day sunlight stretching across the room and softening the usual corporate sharpness. As we worked, I noticed how naturally our approaches fit together. He brought clarity and calm decision-making, while I focused on details and structure. There was no competition, no need to prove anything, just cooperation that felt balanced and respectful. At one point, he paused while reviewing a report and looked at me with thoughtful appreciation. He told me he valued how carefully I handled complex details and how much easier it made things for everyone involved. That simple acknowledgement stirred something deep inside me. It wasn't pride exactly, but the relief of being recognized for what I consistently gave without asking for anything back. We returned to our work, but the atmosphere had shifted, infused with quiet trust. Later that evening, as most of the office emptied and the usual noise faded into a gentle hum, I found myself still at my desk, tying up loose ends. Daniel appeared again, this time holding 2 cups of tea from the cafe downstairs. He offered one to me without ceremony, a small gesture that felt thoughtful rather than formal. He sat across from me and spoke about how the quiet moments in life often mattered more than the loud ones, how the steady and honest connections were the ones people remembered years later. I agreed, realizing how much I had missed feeling understood rather than simply needed. His words carried no expectation, only sincerity, and that made them land even deeper. As the evening light outside shifted into soft shades of lavender and gray, I felt a sense of gratitude I hadn't felt in years. The office, once just a place of obligation and routine, had become a space where growth and reflection were possible. Walking out of the building that night, I understood that what had begun as a simple conversation had slowly evolved into something meaningful, not because it was dramatic, but because it was rooted in respect, patience, and genuine human connection. By the end of that week, I found myself reflecting on how quietly everything had changed. There had been no grand declarations, no sudden shifts that others could point to, yet inside me something had realigned. Each day carried a steadiness I hadn't known before, a sense that I no longer had to brace myself against everything alone. Daniel never pushed, never crossed boundaries, and that restraint mattered more than any dramatic gesture ever could. His consistency created a sense of trust that felt rare and deeply reassuring. One evening, as I packed up to leave, I paused for a moment at my desk, noticing how calm I felt. The familiar pressures were still there, the deadlines, the responsibilities, the expectations, but they no longer felt like a weight pressing down on my chest. Instead, they felt manageable, shared by an environment that finally seemed to recognize my presence. As I walked toward the elevator, Daniel was at the reception counter, finishing up some notes. He looked up and offered a brief, warm smile, nothing lingering, nothing performative, just a quiet acknowledgement that said more than words ever could. That small exchange stayed with me on the drive home. Sitting in traffic, watching the city lights blur past my windshield, I realized how easy it is to underestimate the power of being truly seen. Not admired for convenience, not valued only for productivity, but recognized as a whole person with depth, history, and quiet strength. I thought about how many years I had spent believing that staying silent and dependable was the safest way to move through life. Somewhere along the way, I had mistaken invisibility for stability. This week reminded me that honesty and respect don't always arrive loudly. Sometimes they show up in measured words, thoughtful pauses, and consistent care. When I arrived home, the house was quiet, welcoming me with a kind of stillness that allows reflection. I made myself tea and sat by the window, thinking about how unexpected connections can open doors you didn't even know were closed. What began as a simple office conversation had become an invitation to see myself differently, not as someone who simply endures, but as someone worthy of understanding and support. I knew the future didn't need to be defined yet. There was no rush to label anything or predict outcomes. What mattered was the clarity I felt in that moment, the understanding that growth doesn't always come from big decisions, but from small, honest moments repeated with care. As I prepared for bed that night, I felt lighter, grounded, and quietly hopeful. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't just moving through my days on habit alone. I was present, aware, and open to the truth that sometimes the most transformative experiences are the ones that arrive gently, reminding you of your worth without ever demanding anything in return.